All right, I'm live here with Dr. June Tyson. Thank you so much for agreeing to engage with me in this conversation on grief and loss. How are you feeling?
I'm fine, Latoya. Thank you for having me, and thank you for being open to discussing such an important topic, especially during these times.
Yes, absolutely. It is definitely an important topic. Okay, for those who are joining us for the first time, my name is Latoya Delmadge, and I am a licensed clinical social worker. And I'm pretty much the voice of spiritual awareness, and I use YouTube as that platform to fulfill that purpose. With me today, I have Dr. June Tyson, who is a missionary, and first and foremost, she is a woman of God. Professionally, Dr. June Tyson is an LCSWR and an ACSW who practices psychotherapy with a focus on grief and bereavement. So you're very specific to the topic that we're talking about. And that's the reason why I asked you, June, to join me in this conversation, because I know that you have a wealth of knowledge to share with us around grief and loss. Dr. June Tyson also serves as an adjunct professor for 3 universities and sits on the board of dissertation proposals. You also facilitate trainings on grief counseling for the National Association of Social Workers, as well as other clinical areas of focus. Dr. June Tyson is a professional mentor to me, and I'm happy to have this conversation with her. June is also a member of the Global Health Group. So would you like to tell us a little bit about what the Global Health Group is? What do you do?
Well, Latoya, PULSE is the name of the Global Health Group. It is an acronym for PULSE is an acronym for Pediatrics Universal Life Saving Effort. And we go to places across the globe. There has been a number of places that PULSE have gone to share best practices with pediatrics in Haiti,
Oh, okay.
um, Nigeria, Nepal, and we are opening our borders and expanding our horizons to try to go to other places. And basically, my role as a social worker
Mhm.
is to talk to doctors and nurses and explain to them best practices as it pertains to social work,
Right.
family, and basic therapy and
Right.
basic mental health as it pertains to their population.
That's good. That's good. I think that mental health is a very important space right now, a
Mhm.
very important conversation that a lot of people need to be having right now, coming out of this pandemic, other issues on the rise. Emotionally, it's really triggering a lot of feelings for a lot of people. And so that's very relevant to right now. So that's really, really good. So we're going to be talking about grief and loss. And the purpose of this conversation is to become aware of the stages of grief and loss and to really recognize its impact emotionally on people, its impact on our loved ones, its impact on our friends, its impact in the body of Christ. It's really having an impact. When we think about the numbers that been experiencing in the past 3 months, just in regards to death, just in regards to loss. COVID-19 in itself has taken the lives, according to the CDC, the Center for the Disease Control and Prevention, has taken the life of over 91,000 individuals, which leaves how many families grieving, and how many of these individuals were connected to churches, and congregations who are grieving. And then in general, aside from COVID-19, including COVID-19, over 1 million deaths in the past 3 months. That's a huge trauma issue, because even with the 91,000 or over 91,000, like, no one was expecting COVID-19. So even just recognizing the trauma that is connected with that and how it's impacting people's emotions and people's feelings and how they're actually dealing with that. And so it's important to recognize and identify the stages that people go through following the death, following a loss. It doesn't necessarily, loss doesn't have to be a death. And so this is not just a topic that is specific for now, but it's a topic that we have to continue to talk about, because people are always experiencing loss of a relationship, loss of a job. There's a lot of people who are on unemployment, and so they are feeling a lot of different emotions. And so we just want to break that down and then figure out, how do we support and how do we help people to move on past that. So we want to understand the layers of emotions and experiences. We want to understand that family members are not being able to bury their loved ones right now. So the traditional way that we, put people away and even gain some type of closure, we don't even have that anymore. I know that my husband just recently went to a funeral with his brother. It's his adopted brother, oddly, and just the idea that there was a limit to how many people could be a part of that ceremony. And it's like, 10 people only can be a part of that ceremony that has been so sacred to us culturally for years. And narrowing it down only to 10 people is a loss in itself. And so even dealing with that layer of emotion, that layer of loss, how do we deal with that, and are we talking about it? So why don't you go ahead, June, and just define grief and loss for us?
Okay, Latoya, first, to define loss, you touched upon it a little bit.
Hmm.
You talked about the fact that loss does not just mean death, it means anything that has been destroyed, anything
Hmm.
that you've been separated from, including death, including the idea of failing to win or to gain something. The decrease in magnitude
That's true.
is a loss. And all of these things play a part in our lives, in many areas of our lives.
Yeah.
You mentioned the loss of a job, the loss of a relationship, and things that we may consider insignificant.
Yeah.
If it's decreasing or diminishing the amount of something significant in a person's life, then
Yeah.
that would qualify as a loss.
Right. Right. That's good.
Mhm.
Even hearing that definition, it makes me reflect back on my own personal loss. It wasn't the loss of a loved one, but I remember when I was going for my clinical exam, and the first time I went for the clinical exam, I was hoping to pass, and I had such faith that I was going to pass this exam. I studied, I prayed, and I went in believing God. And when when the exam was over and I seen my score and I realized that I failed by 4 points, I literally went through all 5 stages of grief
Mhm.
in a half an hour. I literally went through all stages in a half an hour. And the idea of my faith in God is what stabilized me in that moment. And so I'm glad that you were able to just really, generalize it. It's not just the loss of a loved one as in regards to death, but it's losses that we experience all the time.
Yes, you talk about all the 5 stages of loss and grief. The thing is about the 5 stages is when Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross
Hmm.
observed these 5 stages, she was looking at people that were going to die, and they
Yeah.
had a lot of knowledge of the fact that they were going to die. And they went
Yeah.
through these 5 stages. And then eventually she had to revise the whole concept of to include those 5 stages in grief, which
Yeah.
is a result of loss.
Yeah.
With grief, you experience affliction, anguish, heartache, heartbreak, sorrow, and sorriness, and a
Yeah.
plethora of emotions that
Yeah.
go along and that are connected with loss. So these 5 stages that we're going to go into a little bit also can be applied to how you grieve.
Yeah.
And people talk about the 5 stages of loss or grief, thinking that you have to go through each one in order. But it's
Mhm.
not a linear order. You can
Right.
go through them in any order
Right.
that you may be experiencing, any
Yeah.
emotion that you may experience at that time.
Yeah.
Well, that's the order that you're going through.
Yeah.
Sometimes people may not even go through every single order, but you do experience those five, many of those 5 stages.
Yeah.
And the important thing that we're trying to discuss and bring to the table as mental health workers is that we need to understand those stages so that we can go through them and navigate them very smoothly.
That's good. That's good. There is an effect when you don't go through grief. When you don't go through grief, a lot of people try to avoid going through it, but there's actually a benefit when you don't actually lean into that process of grieving. You can prolong the process. It's kind of like, okay, I'm going to put something on hold. You're putting it on hold. Eventually you're going to have to go back through it. And it's like, you're going to have that waking up moment where it's like, man, I should have definitely dealt with this earlier, because now I'm back in a space where now I have to deal. And so the idea is to really bring awareness to that so people can understand what's happening with them and know that it is a normal process. It's a natural process. And you don't want to numb those feelings. You want to definitely lean into them in a healthy way. So there is definitely a healthy way to grieve. And we're actually going to be talking about that in a little bit. So let's just go ahead and get into the 5 stages of grief. What are the 5 stages and what do they look like?
Okay, Latoya, with the 5 stages of grief, again, there's no particular order, but there's stages that we have to be aware of as we experience these emotions. The first stage that I'm just going to mention is denial, and that basically looks like not being able to accept the fact that you have lost something. For example, if someone is in a romantic relationship and it's over, then one of the participants in the relationship may not be willing to accept the fact that it's over, and they may be performing and living as if they're still in that relationship. So that is basically denial. Anger is the next stage. That same person may experience intense feelings of anger because their partner is not responding to them as they used to, and they are very angry and livid because the relationship is not as it was. The third stage is bargaining.
So before we get into the third stage, June, I want to stop you at that stage, because I think that a lot of people can identify that anger very easily. I think that even what we are dealing with right now, as far as like race and racism, police brutality, we see a lot of anger. But what is the importance of really identifying that anger? Why do we want to identify the anger? And how is it that we actually deal with that anger? Because there is a very healthy way and there's a very unhealthy way.
Okay, the anger is very important, and it is important to deal with it in a healthy way because, for example, this pandemic, we're dealing with 2 pandemics. We're dealing with COVID-19, and we experienced a great deal of loss as a result of COVID-19. We experienced many deaths. We experienced the loss of our normal lives. Many people experience a hope for the future. They lost their jobs, and something very important that we lost is physical closeness. Now we have to do what they call social distancing, which many people are calling physical distancing instead of social distancing, because we do want to keep that social connection. And even if we're supposed to stay 6 feet apart, that's more physical distancing, but the closeness of the social relationship and the closeness of the camaraderie that you may have with someone is no wise diminished because we're more than 6 feet apart. And then the second pandemic is the racism. And this whole thing with this whole pandemic of racism that has been going on in our country for more than 400 years has made us lose many Black men, the dignity of our race and the respect of our race. This situation with Mr. George Floyd, we've lost much of our community property as a result of looting. We lost self-esteem and confidence, and very importantly, we lost the respect of the police, and we feel that we do not have we don't have their respect, and therefore they don't have our respect, and that relationship is lost. And that promotes a lot of feelings of anger. And this is the anger that we're feeling because the justice delayed is justice denied, and we're not experiencing justice. The loss that we've experienced is so horrific and heart-wrenching that it will produce anger.
Right. And that's, a lot of when people are seeing the looting and, just so much different things, the rioting, that is unhealthy anger. It's coming from a place of grief, and it's coming from a place of loss, but it's being shown in a very unhealthy, in a very negative way. And it is anger, and it's connected to grief and loss, but it's unhealthy anger. And so, when we see the protesting, when we see, people praying and speaking out about what's happening right now, they're angry and they have a right to feel angry, but they're deciding to channel their anger in a more positive way. So I definitely wanted to shed a little bit of light to that. Okay,
Okay.
you can go on with the third stage.
Yes. The next stage after anger would be bargaining. This looks like in this relationship that I mentioned
Yeah.
as an example previously, one of the persons who are not accepting the loss and the ending of the relationship, they would try to bargain with that person. For
Mhm,
example, I'll do this, I'll do better, I'll be better if
mhm,
you would just stay with me.
mhm,
And then trying to make a deal basically with the person so that they will not lose the relationship.
mhm.
Depression,
What does that look like for someone who's lost a loved one?
for someone who's lost a loved one, a good example of that would be David in the Bible when he lost his baby.
Mm,
And the prophet Nathan came to him and said, because of your sin with Bathsheba, because of your sin of putting Uriah on the front line, now you've had this baby out of wedlock with Bathsheba, and now God is going to take the baby.
yeah,
Basically, at that point, David went into prayer and fasting,
yeah.
and his whole logic was maybe if I fast, maybe I can make get God to feel sorry for
Mhm,
me, and I can keep the baby.
mhm.
So that fasting, as much as it was a strong spiritual principle, it was done because he did not accept the fact that the Lord was going to take the baby, and he
Yeah,
was hoping to change his mind.
yeah,
So in bargaining, that's what bargaining would look like in
yeah.
that situation.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. And I think that a lot of people go through the bargaining stage sometimes. Like as you were saying, Dr. Kubler-Ross, she definitely brought that up. She initially came up with the 5 stages for, patients who had a terminal illness, of course, and were in the stages of looking towards death. And sometimes what happens to us, maybe as loved ones, when we know that our family members have a terminal illness, sometimes we bargain with God, whether our relationship with God is not as secure or as strong as we think that it should be, or that we know that it should be. And we go to God, we say to him, Lord, help my loved one to live. And if they live, then I'll dedicate my life to you, or I'll have a stronger relationship with you. And then that loved one actually dies. It
Mhm.
really has an effect on a lot of people's faith. And so that's the reason why we want to even talk about that, because when you don't have a strong faith base,
Mhm.
emotionally you can't be strong.
Mhm.
Those two just can't go. And so we definitely want to encourage people to have a strong faith base, that
Mhm.
even when you are praying to God and things don't work out the way that you're expecting,
Mhm.
even though it may challenge your faith, it's not going to completely diminish it.
Yes, and
Mm,
that's so important. In the next stage, even that person who is disappointed and hurt because God did not hear his request and his
mhm.
pleas will go into the next stage, which would be depression,
Yes,
and they would feel very sad, very dejected, and hope feelings of hopelessness.
yes.
And then eventually they would be able to accept it, but
Mhm,
we want people to come to an acceptance in
mhm,
the Christian faith,
mhm,
uh, that an acceptance that will strengthen our walk with the Lord.
mhm,
We want them to be able to say, okay, Lord, it is your will
mhm,
that I lose this situation or this person or this thing,
mhm,
because I'm sure you have something better for me. I am your child, and in your wisdom, I would trust you and
mhm.
accept the situation.
Right.
So those basically are the 5 stages of grief and loss.
Right. Good. That's great. What are being able to identify the stages that we just discussed right now? It's important for us to identify it for ourselves if we're grieving, and in various situations that we're going through of loss, but also to be able to recognize it for other people, to be able to understand them. I think that when we don't understand what people are going through, and it's not that we have had to have went through exactly what they went through, but just being able to put ourselves in other people's shoe, to be that support for them. And sometimes when we don't know what people are going through, there's no way that we can be able to support them. So being able to identify the 5 stages, you have someone who has experienced the loss, a church member who has experienced the loss, being able to understand what they're going through and at what point. So when you hear them say things like, yes, my loved one is gone, but I can pray to God and he can bring him back from the dead, you can understand that that's, they're bargaining. Or when you start to see them, or hear them saying, I'm not able to sleep at night and this is what I'm going through, you understand that they're in depression, because then you would know how to help them and how to support them. But if you have no type of way of labeling how they are feeling, you're not really gaining an understanding as to where they are and how you can feel what they're feeling in that moment and in that time. And so I know that for me, I had someone a little while ago who knew someone else who experienced a death, and they were reading their behaviors, and the person was isolating, it wasn't responding to them and stuff like that, and they were just like, I don't understand why this person is responding like this, and they were thinking that it was them. And in that moment I understood how disconnected people can be sometimes because they just don't know. And it's like I had to explain to them what the 5 stages look like and allow them to see it has nothing to do with you. It's all about what they're going through. And so sometimes what we can do is cut off connections or relationships with people because we don't understand them, rather than being that support. And so understanding what people are going through, it's a way of just really being able to identify what they're going through, but also figuring out what's my space and being able to support and help them.
That's so important, Latoya, because we want so much to help this
Yeah.
person to get through this situation that we're not understanding exactly what it is they're going through. Some of the ways that we can support a person that's going through loss and grief is to first not try to rescue them, not try to fix the problem.
Yeah.
Grieving does not need to be fixed. Grieving is a process that people need to go through. And though you may come with your well wishes and even your humor and your comments to try to ease their pain, it's not working, because this person needs to go through it. And what we need to do is to support them in going through it. And instead of trying to fix it, to listen to them and let them know that their pain is valid, and that we hear them, and that we give them the space to go ahead and grieve.
Yeah.
Another way to support a person who is grieving is not to force their grief. We would try to say to a person that is grieving, who's isolated and depressed, why don't you talk about it? Talk to me. Tell me how you're feeling. This is the only way to get it out. Well, that person may not be ready to talk about it. And you need to give that person the space to talk about it when they are ready to talk about it. And you're forcing this could be an obstacle to them. So we want to give them the space to heal and let them talk about it when they're ready.
Right.
And the third way to support a person who is grieving is to make yourself available. Just let them know when you are ready to talk, I am here and I want to hear you, because your pain is valid. And I want to support you as you go through these 5 stages.
Right. That's good. That's really good. Let's figure out some ways that we can help people themselves who may be grieving, how to navigate that. One thing that I discovered even quite recently is the difference between grieving and mourning. We all go through grief naturally. It's natural emotions. It's a psychological response to a loss. But at the same time, not everyone knows about transitioning to a space of mourning, right? And so it's really the healthy way to grieve. And one question I have is, anyone who's going through grief, should they be going through it alone?
No, I think that they can get the support that they need if they really feel that they need it, from their family members, from mental health workers, from pastors, from first ladies, from anyone that can sit down with them and help them work through this grief. This is something that we need to do together.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone should be alone in their grief. We don't see anyone in the Bible who was alone in their grief. They always had some sort of support, other people around them to help them go through it.
Right, right. That's good. I think you already mentioned it, but specifically ways to support someone who is grieving. You had mentioned, just being there when they need it. So it's an idea of being present, like you're presently there, whether you call them, they don't feel like talking, on the day you call them, that's fine. I'll give you your space. Know that I am here. Whenever you're ready to talk, I'm here. Whether you give them space for a week or so and you just randomly send them a text, simply I'm here. So they know that when they're ready to come out of that space of isolation, that you are present and you're there. And it's like, can you imagine someone going through grief and you have like 20 people texting you, telling you that they're here for you? You know that, listen, when I'm ready to get out of denial and start dealing with some of these feelings, I have my village, I have my army who's there to help hold my arms up and to take me through this process. It's letting me know that even though I'm feeling, all of this anger and all of this depression, I'm not alone. And so that's the whole point of really having that support system, but also exercising a level of empathy. I think that you already said that, like, understand what other people are going through. You may not have, had like a major loss or the loss of a loved one, but you understand what loss feels like, and everyone understands what it feels like. And that's why I mentioned when I had, failed my exam, like I knew what it was like to go through bargaining. I knew what it was like to feel angry, in that moment, being angry with God. I knew what it was like to, to go through denial. At first I was just like, oh no, what I saw wasn't what it was. I saw something different. I was hoping to go to the desk and them to give me a paper that says I actually passed, after I saw it say fail. And so we all go through this stage, but then it's like when we're ready to get to acceptance, knowing that there are people who are there who's ready to take us onto this new life. Aside from that loss, there is life after the loss. And so it's important to definitely just have empathy and be present there with people. I wanted to just point out, like, some of the symptoms that someone may be feeling as they're going through, grief and loss. People may experience difficulty sleeping, definitely isolation, frustration, guilt, anger, even body symptoms. You may have body pains, you may have fatigue, you may have headaches, you may have crying spells, lack of faith in God. You have to understand that, learn to identify what it is that you're feeling right now, not trying to ignore it. You definitely want to make sense of it, but not trying to just shake yourself out of that space and say, well, this is not acceptable. God understands what we go through when we're feeling, and he wants us to be able to acknowledge our feelings, and he wants us to be able to understand that what you're feeling right now doesn't have to be what you feel tomorrow, but acknowledge what you're feeling right now. And so knowing those symptoms is also very, very important.
Yes. Also, understanding the symptoms and not being confused about the symptoms is very important.
Yeah.
We have a manual in social work and mental health, the DSM-5. That is the Diagnostical Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders. And in 2013, bereavement was a mental health criteria for major depression disorder.
Right.
And when people would come into a psychotherapist, a social worker's office, and we assessed them for major depression disorder, which is a very serious mental health issue. One of the things we would ask them is, are you grieving? Are you in bereavement? Now, as of 2013, we no longer have that as a criteria, because people grieve as a part of loss. And it only becomes a symptom, a serious symptom, if two things are present. If the person is grieving in an unhealthy way for more than 2 months, or if they are experiencing some sort of psychotic symptoms, or they're having some morbid preoccupations or prolonged experiences and feelings of hopelessness, then you have to reevaluate them to see if they are having an episode of major depressive disorder. But bereavement by itself is no longer a diagnosis or a precursor for major depressive disorder. So it's very important to know what you're feeling, how you're feeling, and to be able to articulate that when you are asking for help from a mental health perspective, because you don't want to be diagnosed with something that you don't actually have. You don't want to be overly medicated for something that you don't really,
Yeah.
for a diagnosis that you don't have. So
Yeah.
understanding that and having a social worker or a psychiatrist explain those things to you would be very helpful.
Yeah, that's good. And even the idea of medication, there's always been some controversy around whether or not someone who is going through grief should be medicated, because it's understood that grief is a natural process. And so
Yes.
when you add medication to that, it's like, are we really allowing people to go through that natural process? Why are we medicating it? There's this idea of even being addicted to the medication. It's like you want to be able to encourage a natural, healthy process of going through grief by way of mourning. So that's
Yes.
good. Yeah. All right. So how do we help? What can we do? What can we do as far as like systems? When I think about the church,
Mhm.
this is a very, this is the area that brings a lot of excitement, because when I look at the church, I look at the church as a place for healing, a place where people are broken and they go for healing. Even when you think about addiction, and substance use addiction, you have a lot of AA and NA groups within the church, or substance abuse groups within the church, because a lot of the whole idea of recovery is very faith-based, very spiritually based. And so when you think of someone who's going through a space of grief and loss, and they need a space to heal, what better place to heal than the church, right? And so what do you think about in regards to how the church is really responding to people who are grieving? You think about COVID-19, you think about what's happening right now as far as like the pandemic, racial issues, and we've been in not social isolation, right? Physical isolation.
Well,
I
physical
like that word better.
distancing.
I don't like
Physical
isolation at all, but
distancing.
I can take the physical isolation. And
Okay.
it's like, we're looking forward to coming back to church. And it's like, it's the idea where I'm just like, Lord, we can't come back to church the same way. We can't come back to church with the same systems. You have a lot of people who are in church who are emotionally unhealthy, emotionally malnourished. And it's like, what can we do as a church really to respond to that piece?
Well, I agree with you. For as long as I've been alive, and as I read the history of the church, we haven't really been open to mental health and the issue of mental health. One of the first things we need to do is recognize that mental health is a significant and important issue in the lives of human beings.
Mhm.
People, our mental health is very important, and sometimes people are not experiencing good mental health, and the church needs to be able to understand that, instead of laying hands on them, on people who may have some significant mental health disorders, and trying to rebuke the devil when they have a legitimate reason to be depressed because they may have a chemical imbalance. And I think that the church really needs to understand that mental health is important. Another thing that we need to understand as the church progresses in this 21st century is that mental health workers are just as important as regular healthcare workers. We are just as important and significant to society as the doctor, who everyone suspects and respects, and the nurses, whom everyone respects. Mental health workers are worthy of that same kind of respect, because we do great work in the community in helping to allow people to be made mentally and emotionally whole. Also, we have to come to terms with the use of medication. Sometimes people need to use their medication if they have an episode of schizophrenia, and they may have to be diagnosed with the medication just to keep that under control, and then eventually dial it down so that they would be able to function. And this is something that the church is not always open to, which I do understand, but I don't think we would deprive a person with diabetes from having their insulin. And these mental health disorders are just as significant as a physical disorder or a physical disability or ailment, which would require medication. Another way we need to continue to use prayer as our spiritual foundation and
Mhm.
continue to pray for those people with mental health disorders and
Mhm.
encourage prayer all the time when we're working with people of who may be depressed or
Mhm.
who may be grieving.
Mhm.
One of the final things I think we should do is include a mental health worker in our ministry.
Mhm.
If we see a person who is a social worker or a mental health worker,
Mhm.
include them in the conversation when you're working towards building your church and addressing the needs of
Mhm.
your church.
Yeah. I had, that's a very good point that you made. I went to a conference a few years ago, an AG conference, and one of the speakers who was talking about mental health in the church, she had suggested that just like how we have men's ministry and women's ministry, marriage ministries, we need a mental health ministry. Pastors need mental health ministries. They need to, I was just thinking the other day about how many pastors are grieving their congregations,
Mhm.
people from the congregation who they've lost
Yes.
over the past 3 months, and dealing with it back to back to back, and
Mhm.
feeling like, oh, they're just strong to go through it. They're human just like us, and they're going through grief. And it's like they still have to be strong to be able to carry the load of the church, and for
Mhm.
their families and what they could be going through. And then I also thought about, congregation members who lost pastors over the
Yes.
past 3 months and don't have a pastor, people that they were really looking up to, who they connected with, who probably was their main support, what they could be going through. And so as we were talking, as I mentioned before, that the church is a space of healing,
Mhm.
being able to develop, groups within the church where people can come and know that I'm not going through this process of grief, or I'm not going through this mental health disorder by myself. I have a group that I can come. There's such benefits and such a healing process when it comes to being in a group setting and
Mhm.
having people who identify with what you're going through. And
Mhm.
there are so many people who are in the same space right now, who's going through grief, who may be going through, that denial stage, both at the same time, or all five of them at the same time, or someone else who may be going through, or is already over into the anger stage. And it's like being able to have hope.
Mhm.
One of the groups that I run at our agency, June, is a substance abuse group. And it's like, even though it's a substance abuse group, there are people who are in different stages of addiction, and
Yes.
people who are farther along are able to really, create a space of hope for those who are just starting the journey of recovery,
Mhm.
or sobriety, and being able to be that stance and be that hope and say, listen, where you've been through, I was there. And so
Mhm.
being able to have that space in the church, I believe, is so powerful. And
Yeah.
coming out of this quarantine, going back into church, developing systems that are specific for counseling, developing ministries within the church that are specific for counseling, starting, grief groups and, grief and bereavement groups within the church for people really to come and really go through that healing space.
Mhm. That's so important to implement those things right away, Latoya, because as we open up, you and I are going to become very busy
Yes.
as mental health workers. So many people are going to be experiencing PTSD.
Mm,
So many doctors and nurses are
yes.
going to need
Yes.
support. A lot of healthcare workers are going to need some sort of support emotionally and mentally. And I really see in the spirit a lot of people coming to mental health workers for assistance.
Yeah.
Um, the church needs to be aware of that and
Yes.
be able to meet that need in their for the people in their house.
Yes.
They need to be ready for the holidays because the people who are grieving or who have lost and
Yes.
significant loss, they feel that feeling of grief, experience it very acutely during the holidays. So we need to be prepared for that. Maybe have a seminar for loss and grief during the holiday season. And May is Mental Health Month. And
Mhm.
that is something that we should use that time as the church to educate our parishioners about good mental health and
Yeah.
what it looks like.
Yeah, that's good. I see Nadine says many churches should have a mental health type of ministry. Absolutely, where there is privacy and no judgment. I love that whole privacy and no judgment part, because as mental health professionals, that's what we're trained to do. We're
Yes.
trained to, protect, patients, our clients' privacy, but then we're trained to not have any judgment. If that's anything that we do, we know how to do that. We know how to create a space where people just feel accepted, where they can just unload and not think about, oh my goodness, I can't unload that. No, in our space, you can unload whatever you want, and there's not going to be any judgment. Nadine also says the church deals with substance abuse better than mental health because of the stigma in the Black community. Wow, that's very important. But I believe that just churches should have substance abuse ministries. You know how many patients I work with who, when we get to spaces where they can receive support around changes that they want to make, and I think about, well, which church can I refer? Like, they want to be referred to a church, and a lot of them are coming from a history of being faith-based that they probably have walked away from, and now that they're looking to change their life, they want to reconnect to that faith. And it's like, well, which church can I go through that ministers to this substance abuse need, that knows what I'm going through and can identify with me? And sometimes there's a loss of that, right? When I think about patients who I provide services to, and they're like, when we think about, well, what support systems can you put in place to help you when you feel alone, or whatever the case may be, they want to be connected to a church, but like, does the church really have specific things that are tailored to what I need? And we don't want people to go in churches and feel like they're lost. If they're going to go anywhere, they should be going to the church. But is the church really set up to minister to their specific needs?
To talk to what Nadine just said about going to a place in the church where a mental health worker can assist them with no judgment.
Yeah.
I just want the listeners to be very aware of the fact that we're trained not to be judgmental. We're trained to be extremely able to absorb just about anything. I have a cup that has written on it. The cup says, "I've heard it. I've heard it. I've seen it all. I'm a social worker." So, also, something that you said is, I think every church should have, every African American church in the who are working who's operating in the inner city should have a substance abuse support group, or a program, or something that can help people who are struggling with substance abuse, because this is a very big thing in our community and has been for many, many years. And that should just be a staple in the church, just like prayer ministry. Substance abuse ministry. So I think that's something that we all need to put in place right away.
Definitely put in place groups that are specific. And I think that you nailed it. Someone who's trained, right? So, sometimes we make the mistakes of making the pastor everything, making the pastor to everything. One thing is not fair to the pastor to be able to hold so many roles, but definitely like lean on other professionals who's trained specifically to deal with areas of counseling, to meet like certain needs around grief, to meet certain needs around substance abuse, to meet certain needs around depression and anxiety. I think that if we would really to go through and take a toll of how many members of our church are suffering with depression, suffering with anxiety, and just continue to go along, right? And don't realize that there can be deliverance. I know that a lot of faith-based believers don't believe in coping, and I can understand that part of that. Like, you don't have to cope, you don't have to live with it. You can definitely be delivered from it. And God definitely wants to bring us to that space where we identify what we're going through, we work through it through whatever intervention or skills. Of course, the word is our foundation. The word of God is our foundation. But how do we use the word of God in a very skillful way? So having that training, that's really important. Having someone who's trained to specifically minister in that capacity, that's definitely what we need.
Yes.
That's good. Anything else you want to add? I definitely want to go into some healthy ways of how we mourn, but if you want to add anything, June, before we get to that.
Well, I just want to touch on the different types of grief, just to touch on it for a moment, so that people can understand how they're grieving. And I'm thinking about 6 of them right now. One is called anticipatory grief, where the person has not died yet, but you know they have a terminal illness. So you
Right.
may be experiencing grief before the person passes.
Right.
The second form of grief would be the common or normal grief, where you would go on with your work and in your with your life and have waves of crying and waves of bereavement, and people who are not with you 24/7 would think that you're just living a normal life,
Yeah.
but you have your times of grief and bereavement.
Yeah.
The third one is complicated grief, which is very serious because this person cannot go on with the things of their daily life. They can't work, they cannot sleep, they cannot eat, they isolate. These are the people that really need to go and get mental health counseling, go see their pastor, go see the social worker in their church for
Mhm.
some assistance. The
Mhm.
fourth form of grief would be the delayed grief,
Mhm.
where I think a lot of people who experience this coronavirus
Mhm.
pandemic
Mhm.
would probably have a delayed reaction because of the shock of it all
Okay.
and the quickness in the way it moved and took so many people.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, and so we're still reeling from the whole shock of
Yeah.
losing so many people in
Yeah.
3 months' time. So this may be a delayed grief manifestation for many people where
Mhm.
they actually grieve at a later time.
Mhm.
Another form of grief is inhibited grief, where a person would try to work themselves to death so that they will not have to experience the
Right.
pain of the loss.
Right.
So that's a very dangerous form of
Yeah.
grieving too, because they don't get to get over the grief. They're just trying to mask it, they're trying to suppress it. And
Mhm.
finally, the last form is disenfranchised grief, where also a lot of people may be experiencing from the pandemic. Some people, I know people who are very, very sad because of so many people dying. There is disenfranchised grief because a lot of times we don't know these people. Or the disenfranchised grief is the loss of people that we don't know. Maybe the loss of a pet, the
Yeah.
loss of something else
Yeah.
that's not really grief worthy as far as it pertains to society. And
Mhm.
this will cause a person who is experiencing this kind of grief to suppress it
Mhm.
or as well and never really go through the 5 stages. So I just want everyone to really be aware
Okay.
of the type of grief that they may be experiencing as
Mhm.
they're going through the phases.
Yeah. The grief over George Floyd is huge one right now
Yes.
because a
Oh,
lot of
yeah.
people are saying, "Listen, I didn't know him personally."
Right.
They're feeling it. What type of grief would that fall under? I'm thinking like,
That because we didn't know him, I would say that many people would say that is a disenfranchised grief, but it is significant because we still feel the loss,
mhm.
and we feel the loss as a people,
Right.
as Black people in the
Yeah.
United States, in the world, who have been downtrodden for so many years and have not really gotten any relief.
Yeah.
So, just knowing that a man died in that way, we don't know him, we don't know really anything about him, but
Mhm.
another Black man has died in that way. That is very painful to a
Mhm.
lot of Black people, and a
Mhm.
lot of white people may not be able to
Mhm.
understand that
Yeah.
as as they have not experienced it to the level that we have as a people.
Mhm. Mhm. That's good. Thank you for that. Um, I definitely encourage anyone who has lost a loved one recently or even is going through any type of loss right now to definitely lean into a space of mourning. Definitely grief is the feeling, the internal feeling that you may have, the psychological feeling that you may be experiencing, but mourning is more of really trying to find a way to deal with that grief. And so, being able to tell people your story about that loved one or journaling about the loss, definitely crying, if someone is crying, they're going through grief, they're crying, they're actually mourning, and that's a healthy thing. You definitely don't want to tell someone not to cry. You don't want to tell them, it's going to get better. We don't know how better it's going to get for them or when it's going to get. You want them to be able to be present in that moment, what they're going through, that grief that they're going through right now. You don't want to tell them to be strong. Maybe they want to be weak at that moment. You know what I'm saying? So you don't want to, and you already spoke of, to this, you don't want to force them into a space where they're not right now. You want them to allow them to go through naturally what they're going through. Also, I want to point out, other ways that, people can definitely mourn is talking to friends and family. You want to definitely reminisce about maybe the person you lost, or, good times, if there's a favorite meal that, this loved one ever cooked for you or something like that. I remember, my mom is not gone. She's definitely still here. But, you want to think about what brings you to that happy place when and memory has a way of bringing you to either a happy place or a sad place or angry place just by memory alone. And even this past Sunday, I remember, like, I woke up, and the minute I woke up, I thought about my mom and how she used to cook Sunday dinner, Sunday breakfast. And one of the meals that she would cook is ackee and saltfish, and she would make it with fried dumpling. And the minute I woke up and thought about that, I got so happy, but then I literally smelt the smell of the ackee and saltfish cooking. And so understanding that our senses can play a key role in creating, different emotions and feelings. And so and I got up that morning actually, and I made ackee and saltfish. She helped me. I never cooked ackee and saltfish before, but just that memory of what she used to do for me, that created that happiness, led me into a space where I started cooking, right? That morning. And so, when you think of your loved one, a way to mourn them is to think about happy moments you had with them, or maybe a favorite meal, or, a perfume that they wore that reminded you of them. Anything is going to make you happy. You definitely want to tap into those senses and lean into that, because it can create a lot of joy. It can create a lot of happiness for you in just remembering them in that way. You definitely want to release your anger in a safe way and a healthy way. Anger can definitely lead to hatred. And, even that's what concerns me a little bit more about what's happening right now. I know that a lot of people are feeling angry because of the racial injustice over the years and what Black people have went through. But what makes me a little bit more concerned is that how much hatred is actually coming up because of this anger. And so we definitely want to understand that and be able to have spaces where we having conversations about that, so that way you can recognize when your anger is leading you to a very unhealthy place, or how talking about it in certain ways leads you to a space of, now I'm starting to hate. Being able to identify the anger before it definitely gets out of control is important. Yes, anger is a part of grief, but it can be definitely expressed in a very negative way.
Yes. Yes. And, I think we're doing that now, Latoya.
Yeah.
Policies are being put in
Yeah.
place. The
Yeah.
House of Representatives met today, and the way they mourned Mr. George Floyd was very moving.
Yeah.
They all wore kente cloth sashes.
Yeah.
They kneeled for 8 minutes and 43 seconds. They talked about him. They talked about this issue, and they put policy in place.
Yeah.
And this is the way a nation can mourn in a way that is positive and healthy. And we can do the same sort of thing in our personal lives.
Yeah.
This is the time, when you're mourning, this is a time where you can kind of like focus on the things, like you said, the beautiful part of the relationship, or the beautiful part of the thing the connection that you had with whatever it was that you lost.
Yeah.
It could be anything. I lost my mom, and I know the wonderful things that I did in tribute to her as part of my mourning experiences. And it was very helpful, but I put positive things in place to help me to go through the mourning process in a positive way. So people who are mourning the loss of victims of the coronavirus are out there. They're wearing their masks, they're practicing physical distancing, they're helping with testing, they're giving food out to people who can't get the food right away, and they're being actively involved in feeling better and in encouraging positive emotions within
Yeah.
themselves. And
Yeah.
these are the things that are going to get us through. Yes, we should cry as much as you want and as long as you want. But then after 30 days where Aaron passed away, the children of Israel got up and they continued their journey to the promised land.
Mm-hmm.
So we do want to not be stuck. We want to give ourselves enough time, and we want to make sure the grief is healthy. But we do want to go ahead in the name of that thing or that person that we lost and make a better life, a life that's more beautiful, and a life that will give them great pride and joy in the fact that they had a relationship with you.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Definitely finding ways to remember them and keep their memory alive,
Yes.
your memory of them alive for sure. We have a question. Nadine wants to know, one second. Nadine wants to know, can people be in multiple stages of grief at the same time?
I do think so. Let's talk about David and that whole situation with
Yeah,
him.
yeah,
He was in denial and bargaining at the
yeah.
same time. He
Same time.
was praying and asking God to, take this away. And if I fast, maybe he would take this away. He was bargaining. And of course, we know David was depressed
Mhm.
during all of that, and it only took place within 7 days.
Yeah,
7 days later is when the baby died from the time Nathan came to him and gave him that word.
yeah,
7 days he was on his face, praying, fasting, and bargaining before God,
yeah.
feeling depressed. I'm sure he was angry with himself for putting himself in that situation. We
Mhm.
know David. We know David very well from his writings. So we know that he held his relationship with the Lord
Yeah,
very close. And
yeah,
to be brought to that level where God would have to take his son, he knew that he put himself there, and
yeah.
we know that he was angry with himself. So you can be experiencing all of those emotions at
Mhm.
the same time,
Mhm.
but just be aware of what you are feeling and don't and sit with it.
Yeah,
Sit with it. Don't try to go away from it and move away from
yeah.
it and deny it and push it down. Don't try to suppress it. Just accept the fact that this is normal, this is natural, and this is healthy.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I definitely always encourage, yeah, that's good. You can definitely be in more stages at one time than another. You can miss
Mhm.
a stage. You don't necessarily have to go through denial.
That's right.
Right.
Mhm.
And understanding that everybody's process of grief is different. And so you may have experienced grief in one way, someone may be experiencing it in another way. You don't want to take your experience and expect someone to have the same exact experience. You want them to allow them to go through their own process, like on their own.
Yeah.
Um, I wanted to mention that I had a conversation with a patient about grief. And one of the things that I brought up to them was that, at times as you're grieving, you definitely want to bring other people into that process with you. You don't want to, go through it alone. You definitely want to lean into your feelings. And you want to make God a part of the process. Like if you have a strong faith in the Lord, even if you're angry with him, even if you blame him, he wants you to still make him a part of the process. Even if you were expecting him to come through a specific way and he didn't, it's okay when you have a relationship with him to make him a part of the process. I don't want anyone to feel that I need to go through what I'm going through and then I reconnect with God. As you
Mhm.
go through what you're going through, it can be a very effective way in building your relationship, even more so with him when you make him a part of that process. He wants to be a part of it. So don't feel like I'm going through what I'm going through and I'm just going to, seek therapy. Therapy definitely is an effective tool to use as you're going through grief. It's a great way to mourn, and it's a great way to get support. But at the same time, it's like make sure that God is a part of the process. And so that's why I encourage people who are faith-based. You definitely want to seek out Christian counseling. You want to seek out counseling that connects with what you believe in. And that's the reason why we want to have systems in the church, because you don't want anyone to feel like what I'm looking for here in the church, I can't find it. So I got to find somewhere else. You don't want them to stray away from what is their foundation. If faith and if the Bible, if spirituality is their foundation, you definitely want to keep them connected to that and let that be a part of their healing process. You don't want to separate the two.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very
Oh,
well put, Toya. Very well put.
anything else that we want to add? Let me see if we have any questions. So anything else that maybe you might want to add, June, to this conversation?
No, I think, Latoya, we've explored the basic things that we need to do to grieve in a healthy way, to understand loss, and to eventually come to a point of acceptance, which is the fifth stage of grief and bereavement and loss. To be able
Mhm.
to accept it and move on in a healthy way, in a way also that will give glory to God and to dignify the person that we have lost.
Yep, that's good. That's good. Well, June, if anyone wants to connect with you, where can they find you?
They can contact me at socialworkwithjune.com.
Okay.
And there you would read a little bit about how I work with patients to go through grief and bereavement and all sorts of forms of loss. There are
Mhm.
many articles, mental health articles that one can read, and different information that they can obtain regarding loss and bereavement.
Mhm. Thank you so much, June. It's been a pleasure. You are an inspiration to me. You're the reason why I continue to study. When I think about stopping, I'm like, June is going to say to me, where are you with that, dear?
That's exactly what I'm going to
You
do.
exactly that. So
Yeah.
I appreciate, the contribution that you have made to the field of social work, to counseling, and the way how you're definitely mentoring other social workers like myself, and bringing us to a space where you're always telling us to come up and to do better, to grow, and to definitely merge off into different areas of spaces where we're able to exercise what we've been learning. So thank you so much. Thank you for having this conversation with me, and thank you to everyone who joined with us. Till next time, be blessed, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. If you have not done so yet, definitely hit the subscribe button below and continue to engage into these discussions with us. June, be blessed. Love you.
You too. I love you too, Latoya. Bye bye.